things. I just want to give you the far away view. To get the close view, just go to the calendar on the website. That way it's got the times and the places for everything, okay? But I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that it looks a little fuller this month, and that's because small groups, right, will be happening and be in place. So, again, times and places are on our calendar online. Just go to the website, click on the calendar button, everything's on there. On Tuesday, we're doing the faith fitness. You can see that's going to be happening. So some working out, so some praise music, and it's all going to happen downstairs. You got different stations of working out. And Julie's going to head that up. She's not feeling real good, but hopefully she'll be good by Tuesday. If not, I'm going to leave that sucker. We're going off. And prayer meeting, of course, we're doing that. On Thursday, supernatural power of the transformed mind. That's like a study that Bill Johnson put together about just the transformed mind. And Joanna is going to be, I guess, next door, right? Yeah. So she'll be down there. She'll be the one hitting the play button. And it's a video. And hey, is there some printed materials too with that? Okay. So that'll be happening on Thursday. On Friday, we got another small group called All the Places You Will Go. I couldn't put the whole thing in there. I just put all the places you will go, and I think it's ... who will know. The whole idea being like, what is God's will? Like, how do I know what door is right? Because a lot of times it's sort of all gray. It's just, so how do you like iron that out? How do you figure out exactly, where the Lord is leading? Because that's where we want to go. We want to follow the leader. So that's what that study's about. That's going to happen on Friday night. That's going to be next door, and then Friday night off on Archie Hill. So for the next 7 to 8 weeks, right, small groups are happening. And on Tuesday off, I didn't put it in there, but the teens are also meeting up and starting as well. So that's going to be at Jess's house. She wasn't feeling good either. Hopefully she'll be good on Tuesday. So the idea and the purpose of small groups is to create places, times, and opportunities for all of us to meet together outside of a Sunday to build fellowship, to build community. The case could be made that in many ways a small group is more, I don't know, that was not really a great word, but more advantageous, because it isn't really great either. But in other words, it's really important, arguably as much as important as a Sunday morning. Because when you're in homes and you're just like around people and just doing things like that, that's what it's about. It's about doing life together. And so doing life together just, one time on a Sunday morning, once a week, that's not so much life together. Life together is really together, in your living room and doing stuff. If you choose one, again, it's in that email line. I think people have signed up for different things. That's awesome. You can try more. If you can really only commit to one, then only really do one. All the facilitators are all totally ready. I told all of them, I said, hey, listen, it might be on some nights you're just by yourself. Just the way it works out. And they're all fine with that. They, of course, don't prefer it that way, but sometimes it works out that way. All right? So just do what you can when you can do it. There's lots of ways to connect and get to know all of us a little bit better in different ways, shapes, and forms. Amen? Amen. Okay. So again, that's for about 8 weeks. Then we'll take a break for another couple of weeks, and then we'll jump back in and just keep going. Okay. All right. So let's take our Bibles and let's go to Exodus chapter 12. We'll spend a little bit of time there. So last time we got together, I feel like, the Spirit was just calling us to just take a break for a minute. So we talked about Kairos, right? The Kairos moment. And the Kairos moment is when it describes an opportune time. An opportune time. I think about that as in two ways. So you got Kairos moment, and you have like a redefining moment, a defining moment in someone's life. So a Kairos moment is like, oh, here's my chance, here's my opportunity. The defining moment is when we seize it and we step into it and we go after it. So, in other words, recognizing a really important opportunity is not the same thing as taking advantage of it. So a defining moment is when you step into that. You say, okay, I'm going to take part in this thing, I'm going to go after it, I'm going to do it. This is a defining moment in my life, I'm going after it. We pick up in Exodus 12 on a super defining, the defining moment for the Hebrew nation, for Israel, for Yahweh, for the way He's going to now interact
with all of us. Super defining moment. And for us, I think about, our situation and just what the Lord is building up and what He's doing here. We're not quite yet on the other side to where we look back and be like, oh man, remember what God was doing there? And He calls us to do so. We're not quite on the other end. We're still very much in the middle of it, to where we're still trying to respond in faith to the level that God has called us to. We're still at a place to where we are trying to respond in faith to what God has called us to. We are at a place to where we're trying to respond in faith to what God has called us to. We're still in that place. We're trying to rise to the place where God says, hey, I have this for you. This is the way I want you to partner with me and live your life. And us as a church family, to do that together collectively, we're still in process of that. And the truth be told, you never sort of really arrive, but you get to a place of maturity to where it comes naturally more easier. So we're still growing in that. So as you see Exodus 12 here, so they're kind of on this, defining moment about the Passover. So here's what's interesting, is that the Passover, it's this meal that has been happening for 3,000 years. That's a long time to be doing anything. And they've been doing this Passover meal for 3,000 years because it is single-handedly the most prophetic act of the future promise of the Messiah. And when I say prophetic, I mean that God has set up a meal and things that happen in and around that meal that all point towards the Messiah who would be coming. And it was something that God said, hey, listen, do it this way around these people with these food items, wearing these clothes, and make sure you do it every year. And when you do it, actually take a week to celebrate for it. To make sure that everyone is getting this and grabbing a hold of this. So that way when Messiah comes on the scene, it's all going to make sense and come together and be undeniable that this is the Messiah that's fulfilling this thing called the Passover. So I recommend, Passover is kind of like Christmas in a tradition sense where if you have something going on for a long period of time, things just change. People want to make it their own. You got your own Christmas traditions. You got your own traditions with whatever you do, right? I have them in my family, however it works. And so through 3,000 years, there's a whole bunch of rabbis, and they say, hey, I think we should really add this to Passover. I think we should add this, and then we should do it in this way. And a lot of them aren't bad, but over time it's built up. So now, if you go to a Jewish home now, so 2019 today, and it's April, around Christmas time, and you're going to go to their house for, they won't really call it Passover, they call it a Seder meal. S-E-D-E-R. You'll go there, and that Seder meal will be, depending upon what kind of house you go to, could be an hour to 2 hours long. There's like 15 different things that they will do. And each one of those is rich with symbolism and different events about God's people and what has happened throughout history. And so the Passover that we're going to read about, it didn't quite have all that stuff to it. And I'm not saying that any of that stuff is bad. It's just, it is what it is. Things just change over time. So, I guess the important thing for us is, really the idea is, what does Passover have to do with my life? How is God going to speak to our life right here and now? Where's the good news in it? What can we take away from it? How does it equip us in the spiritual to have more confidence and a greater faith in what God is and what He's like? That's a great question. Let's look at this. Let's read it. Let's unpack some of it. It says, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, this month is to be for you the first month of your year. It says, tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. And if any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with the nearest neighbor, having taken into account the number of people that are there. So let's start verses 1 and 2. He goes right here, he says, hey, listen, right now, everything changes. This is a redefining moment. In fact, everything's changing so much, we're going to change the whole calendar. Changing everything. So the calendar used to be like this. Now guess what? Today is actually how you're going to start your new calendar. From here and for the rest of time. So you look at the Jewish calendar, everything starts for them in April. Based upon Passover. Because God said, hey, this is when it's starting now. So they don't typically, like, in a secular way, they sort of go with our calendar and the way we work and New Year's, and all that stuff. But in their faith, they're starting in April because God said so. So it's a totally redefining moment. And you know what? It makes a lot of sense. And the reason why it makes a lot of sense is because if you talk to any Christian that's been following and walking with the Lord, sometimes you'll hear them refer to their second birthday. Or they'll have things like highlighted or maybe written down in their Bible, and they'll say, yeah, you know what, this is when my life really started. And it's like, well, what are you talking about? I'm talking about when people give their lives over to Jesus Christ, and they go all in with who He is and want to be full-fledged followers of God, that's really when their life starts. And for a lot of people, they mark that down. And they say, you know what? Yeah, I lived this life and did all these things, but honestly, I never really started living until I gave my life to the Lord. And for a lot of people, they keep track of that stuff, and they keep track of when they gave their testimony, when they got baptized, but it all pretty much centers around when they gave their life to the Lord. So there's something that's not that peculiar about God saying, hey, listen, you know what? We got a new calendar, a new time. It starts right now. Makes a lot of sense. Whenever God gets involved and Jesus becomes part of a person's life, everything becomes brand new after that. I'll tell you what, it does all start from that point on. So here he goes here. He's talking about this lamb stuff, right? What's going on with the lambs? Verse 5. The animals you choose must be year-old males without defect, and you may take them from the sheep or the goats. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month. So he said pick them out on the 10th. And he said hold on to them until the 14th. It says when all the people of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight, then they are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and the tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. So that's kind of odd, to say the least. And notice it only went on the sides and the top, didn't go on the threshold. And so, what's interesting to me about that, what I take away from that, is one that's very odd. That they were never asked to do anything like this ever before. I could just imagine some of those Jewish households being like, did you hear right, Moses? Like, that's like ridiculous. Who would do that? That's bizarre. Like the pagan nations were around. They don't paint their house with blood. That's weird. That's strange. What is that? But there's a point to it, right? There's a purpose to it. And we'll unpack the bigger meaning in a little bit, but part of it is God was calling them to, in faith, take part in what He was doing. The way that they demonstrate their faith is by picking out that lamb or that goat, killing it, then taking the blood and paying it on the door. That was their part of faith. And their part of faith is absolutely essential, because if they weren't going to do that, then like what we're just going to read in a minute, the destroyer angel would come and kill the firstborn in that house. So I take that to mean that, you know what? It's not really real faith until we actually do it. People are like, oh yeah, I have faith in Jesus. I believe in God. And what a lot of people are saying when they say that is, I agree with like the historical man of Jesus. I agree that He lived. I agree that He walked and did some good things. But as far as what Jesus did, hungering for righteousness, going after purity, loving people with no angles at all, looking to heal the sick and preach what God has put in His heart, most people don't want to take part in that. But the reality is it's not called faith until we actually do it. In other words, we could say whatever we want to say about whatever. Until life squeezes us, how we respond, that's what we really believe in. So we can say, oh yeah, I love God and I love Jesus and all that stuff. But listen, if we get squeezed and things come into our life and we become an anxious, nervous wreck that runs to substances or to people, and we're looking for all these other things to sort of numb that or control that or somehow minimize it, we have just declared that our faith is not actually what we believe. It's actually centered around some kind of fear that just wants to just minimize and get rid of the situation because it hurts too much. Where faith would say, okay, the Lord has allowed this into my life. I don't know why. Sounds like really bad parenting on his part. But He's let it into my life. He's allowed it. There must be a plan and a purpose. So I can't be filled with worry and anxiety, because then it's going to hijack me recognizing what He's trying to do. So I got to respond in faith and say, Father, this is from your good hand. It looks awful. I don't understand how it comes from your good hand, but whatever. That you have a plan and you have a purpose. So what that tells me is that people can say whatever faith, I have this kind of faith, I believe that, I believe this, whatever. I want to know what you're like when stuff really matters and when it really, the rubber hits the road. That's when you can tell what faith really is when we get squeezed. And so now think about it. Doesn't it make a lot of sense then? If the Lord allows some things into our lives that are challenging, that are unfair, that don't make sense, and we're like, why? He's got to build our faith. It has to come from somewhere. He's got to build it up so it's legitimate, so it's real, so the other stuff that we think that we believe about ourselves gets burned away. In other words, so we're not under the influence that we're a lot better than we really are. Which I love about Peter, because he's like, oh Lord, I'll never deny you. Never. These other guys, you can't count on them. But me, I'm your man. I believe that his intentions were right and that they were pure. And I think that in his mind, he really believed it. Jesus was just pointing out the fact to say, hey, I know that you think that you believe that, but the reality is you're not quite there yet. And so he's like, hey, it's not going to go down like that. You're going to deny me. It's going to be bad news. But Jesus knows He's going to come back and minister to him and heal him, and He'll get back to that point. But much of our relationship with God and the way we walk with Him involves Him cluing us in to where we are actually at. And we know where we're actually at by the things that we do. What we do. I would say what we do. What we do. Not what we memorize, not what we post somewhere. It's what we do. It's what we do. How do I actually do things? What am I doing with other people, for other people? How am I radically loving someone else? Who am I actually really investing into, like the way Jesus invested into other people? How am I radically giving of myself? Like, what am I doing in my life that actually reflects that I believe in a supernatural God that forgave me? It comes down to the doing. The doing. So, he says here, hey, listen, get some blood, paint it. What that tells me is that, hey, listen, it's not real faith until you're actually doing it. Now, look what happens here in verse 8. That same night, they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire, along with bitter, some lamb, right? It's always good. Along with bitter herbs, bread made without yeast. Do not eat the meat raw or cooked in water, but roast it over the fire. Head, legs, and inner parts. Do not leave any of it until morning. If some is left till morning, you must burn it. This is how you are to eat it. With your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals are on your feet, and your staff is in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. I didn't see no mint jelly in there anywhere. I didn't see that. It wasn't in there at all. So it's interesting how the meat goes down. So this meal is rich in symbolism on purpose. We'll quickly look at them. You have an obvious lamb that was slain, right, with the blood, and they're called to eat the meat. Eat all of it. He said, don't even save the rest of it, just eat it all. Then there's these bitter herbs. What is that all about? Bitter herbs. Well, a lot of people are kind of confused on that, and there's not really a great answer, but most people are basically saying, listen, the bitter herbs, and when you go to a Seder, part of their dish involves a bitter herb and dipping it into usually some water with some horseradish or something really bitter in there, and they got to eat it. And what's that supposed to imply and illustrate? Typically, most people are thinking that because they were slaves for so long, that was a bitter life to carry. Also, death was coming to the firstborn, and that is a bitter experience as well. And so depending upon how you read it, how you look at it, no matter what, there's some bitterness involved there. So you have this lamb that they're eating all of it. Then you have this bitter herbs that they're having. Then you have bread with no yeast. And you may have read through the Bible, there's this terminology called the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which comes from here. So let's do it for 7 days. It starts here on this first one. Well, why unleavened? Because the idea is when anybody's ever baked bread, you know that you throw leaven in there. When you mix it all up, then you got to cook it. But you need to give it time for the leaven to actually make that bread rise. And so you have some real consistency in it. So the point that God was telling them is saying, hey, listen, you don't have time for the bread to rise. Don't bother with the yeast. We're going to move quick. Because as soon as this thing is done, we're heading out of here fast. Pharaoh wants you out. He wants you out of here. In fact, your neighbors are going to want you out. Everyone just wants you out. They're about done with all these plagues. And the way that I have been handling this, they just want you guys out of here. So you're moving quick. Then look at the pace. Eat it fast. Eat it fully dressed. Your cloak tucked into your belt. Your sandals on. Your staff in hand. Again, with the imagery of this is going to happen. You're going to be on the move. This is a meal where we're thinking about the Lord and what He's going to do, but we're about to move quick. So verse 12 says, on that same night, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, both men and animals. And I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. Here's what I get from that. Judgment is inevitable and we can't escape it. Judgment is inevitable and we can't escape it. You know, Moses at this point, he's like 80-something years old. He's older, been around a long time. They have been enslaved for 400 and something years. That's a long time for God to execute His judgment. They've been praying for a long time. They've been under oppression for a long time. And I think that sometimes we handle God the same way. It's like, you know what? God really hasn't actually done anything. I've done these bad things. God hasn't really done anything about it. And so I think a lot of times there's this sense of God's approval because He doesn't immediately spank us, that somehow it's okay and He's okay with it. And the truth be told, I actually couldn't be further from the fact. I kind of think of it this way. I don't love spanking my kids. I don't love putting them in timeout. In fact, there's multiple situations where there's just times and I sort of act like I don't hear what they're saying. And I'm just sort of like, I just don't want to deal with it. And it's not so much that I'm trying to, shriek my responsibility as a father. It's that I just, they're so cute, and they're my boys. And I just love them, and I don't want to just jump to the disciplinary stuff, and just, so sometimes they just get away with stuff, and it's just, and it doesn't really help them, and it definitely doesn't help Julie and I, and so it's just, but I don't want to jump to just the harsh and the difficult disciplinary action. So some people make their whole, parenthood about that, never dealing with anything, and so it's like, wow, you've just lost. Like, that's not an excuse to not do what you're called to do. So I think God is also like that as well. The Bible makes it really clear that He's slow to anger, abounding in love and mercy. And it also says He doesn't want anyone to perish. Not one person, not one soul. It says it multiple times. And so was God just, approving of the oppression and things that were happening to them? No, not at all. Was not cool, was not good, was not right. But there's something in the Lord's heart as well. It's like, you know what? He as well wants those Egyptians. He wants people to respond and come to know who he is. That's at his core. It's at his core. In other words, I don't think when the plagues are just, boils are happening on everyone, fires coming from heaven, darkness is happening, frogs are coming in the palace, locusts are eating everything up. I don't think he's sitting there with a smile on his face. They had it come and now I'm giving it to them. I don't see that in his heart at all. And so I think sometimes we mistake that. We don't get the immediate spank, or God doesn't do something immediately wrong if we sin, or something happens or somebody else sins, and they just take that as approval. It's like, man, we're totally misreading the long suffering and the love of God. He's so patient and so long suffering. It doesn't mean he never deals with anything, because listen, I just said, judgment is inevitable and you can't escape it. It's inevitable. It's for all of us. At one point, all people from all time, they will be before the judge, Jesus Christ himself, looking right at him. I just picture, what'd you do with me? What'd you do? And we can't be like, well, never nobody ever told me, nothing ever happened, I didn't really know, like, people didn't represent you well. The church I was in, they fought a lot. It's just, all these things aren't going to matter. Judgment is inescapable. Except if there's some blood involved. Just like in this story. So then we look. And it says in verse 13, the blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. The power's in the blood. The power's in the blood. That will cause the Passover to happen, where the destroyer, it's crazy to think that in heaven there's an angel called the destroyer. I don't want any part of that. Oh my gosh, no part of that. He's just going to pass over. He sees the blood, he just passes over. Is that not rich with prophetic insight that just shows the purposes and plans of what God's going to do through his Son, Jesus Christ? And God is just not into like killing animals and seeing blood spill, and he's just this violent God. No. Nothing could be further from the truth. He's telling us exactly what needs to happen and take place when sin is involved. It's ugly, there's bloodshed, and something is going to be sacrificed in place of. The firstborn of the Hebrews is not going to die because something was killed in its place. That's the gospel story. It's always been like that. It's never ever changed. The power is totally in the blood. And then here's what he says. He says, this is a day you are to commemorate. For the generations to come, you shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance. For 7 days, you are to eat bread made without yeast. That's our feast of unleavened bread. On the first day, remove the yeast from your houses. For whoever eats anything with yeast in it, from the first day, though the seventh, must be cut off from Israel. On the first day, hold a sacred assembly, and another one on the seventh day. Do no work at all on these days except to prepare food for everyone to eat. That is all you may do. Celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and then he goes on how to do it. And if we skip down to verse 29. It says, at midnight the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. And so it's eerily similar to when Pharaoh sent out the verdict and the edict, and he said, listen, kill all the boys in the land because he didn't want any of the Hebrew babies to be alive. And so God had said, he said, hey, listen, the way I'm doing this thing, I am judging Egypt and the gods of Egypt to let them know there is none other like me. And then he does something which is kind of like eye-popping, where he then goes back and then takes their firstborn. Where, also let it be known, they could have taken some blood from any goat or lamb and painted on their doorposts as well, and they would have been fine. They would have been fine. So now, turn to Matthew 28. And we're going to take communion together. And now this should make a lot of sense. So in Matthew 28, sorry, 26. I gave you the wrong one, sorry. Matthew 26. Verse 17 says, on the first day of the feast of unleavened bread. Well, that's familiar now, right? The disciples came to Jesus and asked, where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover? He replied, go into the city to a certain man and tell him, the teacher says, my appointed time is near. I'm going to celebrate the Passover with my disciples at your house. So I guess they had it all set up. I don't know who the guy is. So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them and prepared the Passover. When evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12. And while they were eating, he said, I tell you the truth, one of you will betray me. They were very sad and began to say to him, one after the other, surely not I, Lord. And then Jesus replied, the one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him, but woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born. Then Judas, the one who would betray him, said, surely not I, Rabbi. And Jesus said, it is you. It says, while they were eating, Jesus took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to his disciples, saying, take and eat, this is my body. And then he took the cup, gave thanks, and offered it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. Jesus is doing something brilliant right here, right now. He has them literally around the Passover meal that started with what we just read in Exodus 12. At the same time frame, right, during the same exact time when the Feast of Unleavened Bread happened, the whole deal is going down. He has them there at the meal, where there's the bread, there's the blood. But what was missing from that meal? We never read anything about. There was no lamb. And so you know they're sitting around being like, missing something kind of important. There's no lamb here, right? There's no lamb here going on at all. And Jesus is trying to make it very clear to them and saying, hey, listen, I am the lamb now. I have taken place this. So that lamb that was, and this blood that was shed for the sake of a household so the destroyer would pass over and no judgment would ever happen, that's me now. I'm taking the place of it. So now that's why I'm saying my body is going to be broken and my blood is going to be part of a new covenant. This is being fulfilled right here and now today. Man, that is just powerful. It doesn't get any more prophetic than that. That's the ultimate right there. It's amazing. It's amazing. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take Passover, communion. It's essentially the same deal. And so what we'll do, hold on to the elements.